You're about to hear from Nick Stobbs, this episode's guest, how you, by using AI, can save hours of time and reduce the chances of missing vital information when undertaking tax research. You're listening to episode 90 of the Tax Professionals podcast, the podcast that helps you and other tax professionals to progress, develop, and improve your careers.
Welcome to the Tax Professionals podcast, the podcast dedicated to helping you improve your tax career. Here's your host, Jack Bonehill.
Hi all, and welcome to this episode. About a month back, I got introduced to Nick Stobbs, who co-founded Tax on Demand, an AI company specialising in tax. I was introduced by CTA prize winner Autumn Murphy, who's been on the podcast in the past. She told me that Nick and his team have developed a product called Copilot, which is essentially a chatbot like ChatGBT, but for HMRC manuals instead. I was intrigued. If you've been listening to the podcast for some time, you'll know that I strongly advocate that all tax professionals have strong research skills and that tax research is arguably the area of tax I enjoy the most. Hence why I created and I continue to deliver the Tax Research Masterclass. And whilst I never advocate only using HMRC manuals, they do play a key part in tax research. But using HMRC manuals can be time consuming and it can be difficult to find information that you want. And you need to take care to not miss any vital information. So the thought of using AI to help with all of this sounded great. I thought it'd be good to have Nick on the podcast to explain what Copilot is, how it works, how we as tax professionals can integrate it into the work that we do, and why we should use and embrace AI when doing tax research. The tool is currently in pilot stage and it only looks up information in HMRC's manuals. And once the tool is finalised in relation to HMRC manuals, the tool will be improved to also cover legislation, case law, and tax commentary as well. And I dare to think how incredible the tool will be once all that is done. Given how powerful this tool will be, I was somewhat worried about whether AI is going to make tax advisors redundant or make us less valuable. So I got Nick's perspective on this. And his perspective is reassuring, as you will hear, as he sees us very much working with AI in a collaborative way. Technology is full of jargon at the moment, as you will hear from the terminology that it uses, with terms like large language models and RAGs. So I made sure we got some clarity on these and what they mean. And on both of these points, large language models and RAGs, Nick explains what they are with an amazing analogy using a librarian. Overall, I think how tech can currently help us and how it will keep improving is exciting. It might be hard to embrace at times, but we need to keep up with the times and make sure we don't get left behind. And I'm hoping that this episode will help with that. For rough timings of each section of this episode, you can head on over to the details section of the episode within your podcast player of choice, or head on over to the show notes for this episode at thetaxprofessionalspodcast.com/TTPP90. The link to the show notes is the only link that you need to remember for this episode, as all the links mentioned throughout, including a link to Nick's website, his LinkedIn profile, a link to sign up for the current free version of Copilot, and a link to the Tax Research Masterclass mentioned earlier, are all included in the show notes. Talking about the Tax Research Masterclass, the next one is at the start of Feb 2024, and it's ideal for you if you want to or need to be really good at using tax legislation, HMRC guidance, other guidance, and or case law. You'll learn how to find the answer to any tax question and undertake research for any scenario, even the ones that are complicated, and all you have to do is put what you learn in the masterclass into practice, and I help with that by setting you live exercises to do during the course and also relevant homework exercises for those of you that want to do those too. In the masterclass, I also share real examples from my experience, including actual documents and emails that I produced, and I also give you some guidance on how you can document your research regardless of what the scenario is for your research. For full details of the masterclass and how to enroll, head on over to thetaxprofessionalspodcast.com/masterclasses, and there is a link to that in the show notes. Without further ado, let's get to the episode. Can you tell us a little bit about you and your involvement in tax in your career to date?
Yeah, thanks, Jack. So I'll take it right back to the start. So when I was younger, I used to read all the John Grisham books, and I used to watch all the law movies, the legal movies. And one of my favorite ones is the famous line about you can't handle the truth in the court case. So I decided from a young age, I really want to be a lawyer. This looks really good. This looks quite exciting. So I went off to university, did a law degree, realized very early on that I didn't want to be a lawyer. Kind of sat through 2 hours of jurisprudence lectures and pretty boring stuff. So realized that wasn't really for me. Finished my law degree, got a 2-2, Went back to do a master's in business management and finance, applied myself a little bit better to that, ended up getting a first class master's. And then straight after that, went into an accounting practice called Peters Elworthy Moore, in a PM these days, but a large independent practice in Cambridge. Sat in their business tax team from day one, just started preparing tax returns, and realized pretty early on that actually just pure tax work wasn't really going to be for me. We did do some share valuation work, and that's what got me really excited. So long story short, I started a share valuations practice with a few. I was very lucky. A friend of my dad's was a former partner at BDO and is semi-retired. So I pitched an idea of a share valuation, kind of a specialist share valuation practice to him. We went off and formed that partnership, ran that for 5 years. That led us into the AVN network. AVN led us into Abbey Tax. I ultimately ended up working for Abbey Tax. And then that was around about 2016. And then from then I've been focused on tax technology.
Because when I looked at your LinkedIn profile and like your experience there, like I got the impression that you kind of started off doing tax work at PM. I didn't realize the second thing was tax related. And then when you went to like Abbey Tax and stuff, if I remember right, it seemed like you moved into more like a sales type role. Is that right?
Yeah. So kind of flipped really. Probably spent I kind of broadly break my career down into 3 parts. The first part was really kind of pure tax compliance focused, kind of technical work. So that was around the work at PM, and then obviously the share valuation work. When we started the share valuation practice, we partnered with AVN, probably in their heyday when they had about 400 or 500 accountants in the network. And we had a really good time with AVN. At that point, I met Alison Lynch. Alison Lynch was running Howarth Lynch. Howarth Lynch then sold into Abbey Tax. And then Abbey Tax obviously became part of Markel International. And Ali knocked on my door one day and just said, would you be interested in coming over to kind of Abbey Tax Markel and helping us grow the specialist tax services that we offer? So Markel, obviously, what Abbey Tax Markel had about 2,500 accountants that would take their fee protection insurance product. And what they were looking to do was to build out a specialist tax service to those accountants as well. So I sold my share of the practice, sold my share of the partnership, went over to join Ali at kind of Abbey Tax Markel. And I kind of wore 2 hats when I was there. We were still running a share valuation team. So we started up a small share valuation practice within that business. But yeah, that was the time of my career when we started to evolve into kind of sales, business development, if you like. And that was really where the ideas around technology all started to develop. So that was probably about 2014, 15. So kind of nearly 8 years ago now to evolve the ideas. But yeah, kind of moved from just purely technical roles, started to wear 2 hats. And now I've kind of taken both of those hats off and work in technology now.
Yeah. What is it for you then that makes you like change between all these kind of areas all the time? Is it that you get bored? Is it just like something new often? Like what is it? Because it sounds like you've done it a lot actually with like the law degree, realizing, I want to do law. Oh, no, I don't. Then doing your master's, doing tax. Oh, I don't really want to do that. And I want to do you know what I mean? Like you flipped quite a lot, haven't you, over time?
Yeah, I think for me, the biggest motivator for me is excitement and new things and finding new doors or new opportunities when they arise. So obviously, going to university to do a law degree, I thought I wanted to be a lawyer. And then actually the one thing that made me realize I probably didn't, and actually I was probably more interested in business than I was law, is we did a free elective. So one of the modules, you get a list all these modules you can take, but you do get an option to do a free elective, which means you can go to any other kind of school in the university and take one of their modules. And a few of us that were doing law degree together, we were kind of business minded, if you like. So we all said, well, let's go over to the business school and do one of their modules. And we kind of went over and we did it. And all of us kind of looked at each other and thought, this is, we're in the wrong school here. We should not be doing law. We should all be doing business, really. But finished the law degree and obviously went back to do the master's. That was the reason why I went back to a master's in business management and finance, was just that little taste that we had made me realize that was for me. So that was really just finding something that I thought I was better suited at. I enjoyed more. It's kind of where my motivation was. Same with the corporation tax stuff, the business tax stuff at PEM. It was I was doing share valuations. So I've just preferred doing those to corporation tax returns. And then when we were running share valuations, the idea of actually selling additional tax services or tax advisory services to accountants was more exciting. So kind of jumped on that train.
Yeah.
And then whilst we were doing that, the idea of why are we going out and doing reviews, doing client reviews for accountants, why, technology should be doing this. This is very manually intensive, time consuming work. Technology should really be doing this work. And that was about 7-8 years ago. And obviously the sort of technology we build now. So we're very much a decision intelligence and a generative AI business. So we've got kind of two bits of technology that we built out. The decision intelligence was very much around then. So we started to apply that. The generative AI obviously was around at that time, but not really commercially known. So that's kind of obviously had a boom in the last 12 or so months.
Okay, just for everyone then, can you explain what decision intelligence is and generative AI is in simple words that maybe your granddad would understand?
So decision intelligence is all about emulating the decision-making ability of a human. And for us, that human happens to be an expert and happens to be a tax expert. So the same logic that a tax advisor would apply to a situation, we are effectively building technology or decision intelligence, which can emulate that. So just copies how they think and what sort of decisions they arrive at. And then generative AI is really the darling that's captured the imagination of the world over the last 12 months. I think you'd be pretty hard pressed to find anybody that hasn't read about it, or heard about it, or had a little play. But that's really about generating human-like text from prompts. So I ask a question and it will go and generate a text-based response for me. That, depending on which model you use, etc. That based on various data sets.
Yeah. So when you started the tax tech business, you focused initially, didn't you, on decision intelligence, but then you kind of flipped a bit more into the generative AI. Is that right?
Yeah. So when we started, it was very much around automating the tax review process. So we know we started off doing a lot of research into the UK tax code. So looking at the legislation and how that's evolved since 1965. So for 30 odd years, it was Finance Act was on average 175 pages in length. And then from 93 onwards, it then increased to 435 pages. So you had this compounding problem within the UK tax code, which are, already existing complexities, and then just additional layers being added on each year. Then you've got the legislation, then you've got case law. And then we looked actually how that's all of that knowledge, how that's practically applied to a client base. And, if you're an accountant in general practice, how am I taking all of this knowledge and applying it to my client base to make sure my clients are getting the right advice each year? And primarily that was through checklists. So we then kind of moved our research phase into looking at the checklists, and we realized that they were limited in scope. So even the best ones out there were only covering about 60% of everything that could possibly be looked at, and others a lot less. So really our starting point was to say, could we take all of this knowledge, could we turn that into some sort of review process? So as an accountant in general practice, I know that I'm looking at everything I need to look at for a client every year. So elections, claims, all my compliance, tax compliance stuff. Could I look at all of that for every single client every year? Now, kind of before we looked at it, it was kind of impossible. There was absolutely no way that you could run a detailed checklist for every single client every year. There just simply wouldn't be the time to do it. But that's where the decision intelligence comes in. You can run a checklist in seconds. So it takes us about 3 seconds to do a client review. If you were to do the entire practice, it would take about 15, 20 seconds. So that's really where the benefits of decision intelligence come in, is we can make decisions on large volumes of areas in seconds. Mm-hmm. So that was the starting point really for us.
So the kind of thing that I'm most interested in, to be fair, is I think you're calling it Copilot, which is, you described it to me previously as like the equivalent to ChatGBT, but for asking tax questions and getting the answers from it. Tax research is probably my biggest strength, I would say, as a tax advisor. And when you were talking to me about it, I was getting a bit worried, thinking, like, is my big strength going to become redundant over time? I think that's not the case based on other things you told me. But could you tell us a bit about this equivalent to ChatGPT, like what it does, how it works, what are the different pieces to it being created?
So now it's a Copilot, it's a Chat GPT style tool, and effectively for tax research, well, for any kind of research really, but specifically for tax research purposes, if you've got a question, then that might be a spot question. It might be what's the VAT rate on children's clothing. It might be what's the current corporation tax rate, or it might be something a little bit more detailed. You can effectively fire your question into the system, and it will generate a response for you. And we'll probably end up talking about this in a bit more detail later, but it's ChatGPT style, it does use large language model technology, but really it's a system that's built around retrieval augmented generation. So what's called a RAG model. So there are significant limitations to large language models. There's 5 very obvious ones around explainability, the fact that they can be overly general, real-time updates, or kind of the latest data source they've got access to, limited context understanding, and then obviously limited interaction as well. So with some tax questions, you do need to, you need to ask lots of probing questions in order to arrive at the right response. Now, a typical general large language model like ChatGPT, not brilliant for that sort of stuff, but a RAG model is very good, because what that allows you to do is it improves the accuracy of the answering. So it will go into, so for example, if you ask us a question based on HMRC's manuals, the system will actually go into the manuals. It will find the section of the manuals that has the answer, and that might be the specific section, but it can also then broaden its scope to look at other relevant sections, anti-avoidance sections, for example. And it will take that page, it will package that up with the question, and it will then push that through LLM technology to generate the response. But what you get is you get that increased accuracy because you've got that specific page with the answer. You do have it in real time, so we obviously keep our databases up to date with the latest information, and then you get the citations and the references. So we can actually show you where we've generated the answer from, and then you can click through for kind of onward research. So that's tool number 2. They're independent at the moment, but there's definitely a place in the future where they both work together. You can review the clients, and you can then start to use that sort of co-pilot technology to look into that client in a bit more detail, and then communicate to the client as well. So it can generate draft emails for you, draft letters, that sort of stuff.
So just to cut through a little bit of jargon then, so large language model, so what does that actually really mean? Does it just mean that they can produce something that is like having a conversation with a real human? Is that it, or is there more to it than that?
Yeah, so large language model, effectively, imagine you've got the smartest, your friend is the smartest person in the world. They've read tons of books, they've read loads of articles, they understand the content on every single website. You ask them a question and they can effectively take all of that knowledge and they'll just give you the answer. So it's a little bit like the good comparison is, if you think, it's a bit like a librarian. If you go into a library, it's probably the best analogy I've ever heard, is if you go into a library, pre-large language model world, the librarian will be able to point you in the direction of the book. So it's on that aisle, it's probably on that shelf, and then there might be 5 or 6 books there that you've got to find. You've then got to take the book off the shelf. You've either got to go to the context page or the index page. You've got to then find the relevant page in the book, read it and understand it. So that's quite a long process. And actually what a large language model does, if you were to walk into the library and you just say, I've got a question on the determination rules for IR35 status, something along those lines, it would just, rather than having to go to the aisle, the shelf, the book, etc., the librarian would just say, yeah, I know the answer to that. And they would give you the answer straight away. So that's probably the best analogy I've ever heard on large language models.
Mm-hmm. They tend to not just like parrot information though, do they? Do they have like a bit of a, I suppose, a brain themselves where they actually like phrase it in a new way, for example, that actually answers the direct question you've answered? Or does that not really happen? Is it more like, I suppose, just copying and pasting the information to you?
So the way it works is it's literally working out what the next word should be. So it will think of word number 1, and then, all right, based on word number 1, what should word number 2 be? Based on words number 1 and 2, what should word number 3 be? Based on 1, 2, and 3, what should word number 4 be? So as you start to work through the answer, you start to get a little bit more accuracy, because it's saying, well, actually, I've got 50 words here, so I know what word 51 should be. Mm-hmm. There's a really good, speaking in kind of the kids' language these days, but the GIF, the Wallace and Gromit GIF, where Gromit is putting the train tracks down as he's going, that's how the large language models work. It's based on what I've just told you. What's the next best word? Yeah.
Okay. So then let's flip it then to so I remember the acronym, but not what the words are. So RAG, retrieval augmented generation. So what actually is that then in simple terms?
So very, very similar to how a large language model will work, but rather than having to go out and find the answer from a vast data set, you're effectively saying to it, the answer is on this page. So you can hand that page to the large language model, and it will generate the response from that page. Now, all the testing that's been done in the industry suggests that actually, if you can get that page, if you can actually slice that page down to maybe a sentence or 2, or perhaps even a paragraph, that will give you the best response. But really what you're doing is you're building a system which goes and finds exactly where the answer is and then passes up through the LLM technology to generate the response. Okay. And the benefits are you then get the source reference, the citation, so you know where that answer's come from. Very, very difficult to hallucinate on that basis. And also you can make sure that documentation is up to date. So, this year alone, there's been 797 new HMRC manual pages introduced. There's been 3,600 page updates. So with a RAG model, as long as whoever's providing the RAG model is on top of that, you're referred to be passing up-to-date information into the system. So if something changed on Friday, for example, and you ask a question today, you're going to get the latest available data. If it changes again next Friday and you ask it on Monday, you're going to get the right answer.
Mm-hmm. So if we go back to your librarian analogy, then in this case, it's more like the librarian tells you what book it is, you give it to them, they read it, and then give you the answer.
Yeah, so the librarian, yeah, exactly that. So on a RAG model, using that analogy, the librarian will go to the aisle, the shelf, get the book, they'll read it, they'll understand it, they'll come back to you and say, this is your answer, and they'll literally open the book in front of you and say, and here's where I got the answer from. Mm-hmm. And the beautiful thing with the RAG model is as well that the librarian will be reading every single book every single day. And if there's any changes, they'll know.
Yeah, reading every single book every single day.
But that's why the technology is fascinating, because it's doing stuff that the human just simply couldn't do. That's why it's so fascinating.
There was something I watched when I was younger called Chuck. I don't know if you've heard of it. It's a TV show, and he had like a chip essentially planted in his brain, and he could do. Do you know the one I'm on about?
I don't, but I can visualize the chip in the brain.
So he could basically do everything. He could do anything from martial arts to being able to speak any language like immediately. So it's basically a bit like this, but obviously that's probably never going to happen, right, in reality. But it's just reminding me of it, I suppose, the concept of having all that information just planted into your brain every day.
Yeah, and that's really what we're trying to build. When we first started off, so when we sat down with Rebecca Bennyworth and Paul Applin are involved in the business, and when we sat down with Becky and Paul at the very outset, the pitch really to them was a concept around building the world's most intelligent tax advisor, and it wasn't building this tax advisor to replace jobs, and that's always been the elephant in the room for the last few years. Is what about jobs? What does a profession look like with this technology? What does human AI collaboration look like? How do we all work in harmony? And that was how we pitched the idea originally, was around this intelligent tax advisor, this piece of technology that actually could understand the entire UK tax code. So the legislation, the manuals, the case law updates, it could understand all of this. It could also then understand the commentary. So the kind of published books, all the commentary that comes around the tax code, it can understand that as well. And then it could help you particularly apply that to your client base. So for us, it was kind of that sort of idea of having a chip in your brain. World's most intelligent tax advisor, but using it for kind of human AI collaboration rather than replacing jobs. All about kind of empowering and enabling the existing professionals to better serve their clients, really. All that manually intensive and time consuming work, technology could take care of that, and actually then just leave the accountant to do what they do best and really what clients value the most, which is providing advice.
If you want to or need to be really good at using tax legislation, HMRC guidance, other tax guidance, and case law, then the Tax Research Masterclass is ideal for you. You'll learn how to find the answer to any tax question and undertake research for any scenario, and all you have to do is practice and use what you've learned throughout the masterclass. And I help with this by setting you live exercises and relevant homework exercises that you can do if you want to. I also share real examples from my experiences, which includes actual documents and emails that I've produced over the years. And I also give you some guidance on how you can document your own research too, regardless of the scenario. The next Tax Research Masterclass is in February 2024. For full details on how to enroll, head on over to thetaxprofessionalspodcast.com/masterclasses. A link is also in the show notes, which can be accessed at thetaxprofessionalspodcast.com/TTPP90. Hopefully I'll see you or some of the colleagues on the masterclass in February. Mm-hmm. So then, I suppose on that note then, how would you actually see it benefiting tax advisors? Is it essentially to save them time? Because like obviously when you do research as a professional, you have to go and find the right material, I suppose, understand it, and then like write something up. And with this tool, it will, I suppose, almost shorten that process of finding the information, right? Because it will do that bit for you, at least a large chunk of it. It will understand it for you as well and then give you something back. So how do you actually see it like benefiting us day to day?
Yeah, so I think a slightly higher level view on that. As a business, we're making two very big bets. One big bet is on the accounting profession as a whole, so the accounting and tax profession as a whole, that's going to endure and that's going to be around for the next 5, 10, 20 years. It will evolve, but we will always we will always have the need for accountants, tax advisors, etc. So that's kind of big bet number one for us as a business. And then big bet number two is all about human AI collaboration. So the future will be human experts building expert systems, basically. So they're the two big bets that we're making. As I said earlier, the thing for us is all about what are accountants and tax advisors currently doing that's manually intensive, it's time consuming, it's therefore economically inefficient. And what could technology step in and do faster and more efficiently, and potentially even more accurate as well? And then can we really build all the tools out? Because that's really what we're about. We're about building tools. So we can offer an accountant or a tax advisor a toolbox and say, all of this stuff that you've traditionally done, we can take care of that. So tax research, for example, rather than having to get the book off the shelf and read it and understand it, or rather than going into a digital platform and navigating your way through, that might take you 5, 10, 15 minutes. You don't need to do that anymore. You can just fire the question into a Copilot style tool and it will generate the answer for you. The technology will do the reading and the understanding. And that's really how it generates the text response for you. In terms of the search and providing you with the content, it will give you the citations and the references. So it'll show you where it's got the information from. And then if you wanted it to, it could then draft the email or a letter to a client for you as well. So it's taking that traditional process of either researching via books or digital platforms and just changing it slightly. So you go from, the traditionally it was books, then you evolved into digital platforms. And really what you're going to see now is an evolution into generative. So kind of books to digital to generative seems to be the path.
Mm-hmm.
But it's all about, the tax research, the quick questions, the more detailed stuff that kind of takes multi-turn Q&A with a chatbot, if you like. You can develop some stuff that would ultimately be client facing. So triaging questions that come in from clients, you could almost just answer those, or certainly the technology can answer those on the spot. So really that stuff's not making its way into the practice, therefore making everybody kind of internally a little bit more efficient as well. And then the big stuff on the review thing is, what would be anywhere between a 1 hour, maybe a 4 or 6 hour task, depending on the complexity of the client, can also be done in seconds.
Mm-hmm.
So it's really about empowering, those two words about empowerment and enablement, and actually just giving either the accountant or the tax advisor all the information they need to go and better advise the client. I suppose it's not necessarily a big bet for us, but certainly one of the bets we're making. Yes, around the accounting profession. Yes, around human AI collaboration. But the third one, if you like, is all around. It's a human to human business profession. It's, clients still want advisors. They still want to, now you might not see them face to face as much these days because of Zoom and Teams and various other bits, but you still want to be advised by a human. That's kind of the third bet we're making as well.
So one thing you mentioned a few times, by the way, is that it will go to the specific page, it will get you the answer from that page and it will cite it. But in a lot of cases, there won't be a specific HMRC page or a specific piece of legislation that directly answers your question, right? You've got to interpret it and then apply the principle or the rule to the circumstances that you have. Is the kind of Copilot and similar things, are they good enough to do that, like the more complex queries, or are they only good at answering the simple ones where they can find an exact page that's answered this precise question, if you see what I mean?
Yeah, they are. I think what's pretty interesting with large language models and with RAG technology, we're still exploring the boundaries of all of this. And actually, what's the art of the possible? What are they capable of? We've probably covered maybe like less than 1% of what they can actually possibly do in the future. But that being said, there's only a certain amount of knowledge, if you like, that you can feed into these systems. There's the legislation, the manuals, and the case law is kind of what we would call publicly available knowledge. You've then got the published content, which is really commentary around the publicly available data knowledge. And then you've got private data. So you've actually got the client's financial and non-financial information. The beauty is when you then start to combine everything. So you can do knowledge queries into the manuals, the legislation, the case law, etc., with a little bit of supplementary commentary on that as well. But then you can do data queries into client data. So we're experimenting at the moment. We're building proof of concepts where we're looking at particular areas of tax and I'm like, what does this look like? Can you please explain this area of tax for me? And what does it look like in the context of client X, for example? And it can go and do the knowledge query, come back, and then it can go and do the data query, and then it can generate a response for you on that basis. So that's quite interesting. Then you've got to look at the multi-turn stuff. So how do I engage with this piece of software? How do I ask it a question, get an answer, and then maybe reframe my question or ask it a slightly different question based on its answer? How do I go down one route of questioning and then maybe come back and go down another? So really what you want to do is you want to build the technology so that it's as if you were speaking to a tax specialist in that particular area, that particular field. And I think that's when that becomes super useful, because traditionally at the moment in the profession, there are hundreds, if not thousands, of specialist tax advisors out there. You can engage them on a particular topic. The challenge is when you're engaging a human on a particular topic, there's things like time availability is massive. And where we see it is that a piece of technology you can interact with that and find the answer in minutes rather than weeks.
Use case.
So when we think about what they're capable of doing and we think about triaging questions or kind of technical research questions, there's probably 80% of tax technical questions can actually be triaged very quickly. But maybe the technology isn't there at the moment. Or maybe if you are going to a digital platform and you're navigating your way through to find the answer, it's a very inefficient way of doing it. So you can actually have this technology in the hands of every single person in the practice. So there's an efficiency gain throughout the practice. And then on the real-time updates and alerts, something we're really interested in is if you ask, touched on it earlier, but if you ask us a question today and we provide the answer and we give you the citation for the document, if that HMRC manual page, for example, changes on Friday, or if there's new guidance. So R&D is a very, very, very well-trodden path over the last few years, but there's been a lot of changes to guidance over the last few months. And what the RAG technology allows you to do is to say, well, actually, you asked us a question. Maybe we asked the question today. Maybe the guidance is updated on Friday. What we can then do on Monday is say, look, you asked us a question last week. We know that guidance has been updated. Now we could either generate a new response for you, or we could point you back in the direction and say, you might want to just ask us this question again because the guidance has changed. And that's what's really exciting, is this idea of the legislation updates itself naturally with every finance act. That's very well signposted. It's incredibly visible, but it's the stuff underneath that, the manual updates. And as I say, the 797 new pages, 3,600 page updates. It's that stuff that's really interesting and pretty useful to keep on top of.
Yeah. I mean, most of the time, to be fair, like any of these changes that they make to the manuals are tiny and not going to make a difference really. But obviously there are those times where they do make a big difference, because HMRC has done a 360 on their current view of something. And obviously in those cases, to be able to be notified that it's changed for that particular client is going to be massive, right? Because it's impossible to, let's say that you did know that page had updated, you just somehow knew it, to then think of every client that it might impact based on advice you've given them, even let's say the past month, is pretty difficult, never mind in the past year or 2 years or 3 years.
Yeah, and that's where it's really interesting. What we're not saying is everything's updating. It's not like the Matrix and everything's updating all the time. And it's like, how do you keep on top of absolutely everything? It's that one update or that one change which may have a profound impact on the practice. And it might not even be the whole practice. It might just be one client. And when we spoke to Rebecca at the start, we were pitching the idea. It was around the time that the rules on tax for landlords was changing. And one of the things that kind of hooked her right at the very start was, it would have been brilliant if I could have just pressed a button or clicked a button, and it would have just popped back to me and said, right, go and speak to these 10 clients. This is the impact on them. And it kind of arms you with the evidence to go and have a conversation with them. So we're not trying to portray this idea that it's the Matrix and everything's moving all the time, but it's a system that gives you peace of mind that if there are any changes or there is an impact on the practice, we'll pick it up and we'll surface it. And then obviously give you the evidence to go and action it.
Yeah. So you've touched upon this a little bit already, because you've said that you don't see AI, at least anytime soon, replacing tax advisors. But one thing that crossed my mind is, could it dilute specialisms somewhat? Because for me, working in employment taxes, because I suppose there's so much tax information out there, the fact that I specialise in employment taxes means that I either know the answer straight away when someone asks me a question in that area, or I know very quickly where to go and look to get to the answer, right? And that's almost like a USP for having specialisms. But if you have these language models like Copilot, etc., that can potentially just give you the answer to any question, regardless of the area of tax, quite quickly, do you see that that will potentially stop specialisms being a thing, or at least not as much of a thing as they are currently?
Yeah, I don't think it would ever replace specialists. I mean, ultimately, one of the bets we're making is that you still need kind of expert or specialist humans to make specialist expert systems. One of the big things we do is code expert logic. So we map it to begin with, and then ultimately we go and code it so we can scale that knowledge throughout practice. So I think the specialists are always going to be there, particularly when it comes to tax. There's not always a binary answer, and there's not always a clear answer. A lot of it's around interpretation. A lot of it's around the client's appetite for risk, for example, and the client's circumstances. So where I think research is the key word here for all of these tools. It can aid research. It can point you in the right direction. It can retrieve information and knowledge for you quicker. In some instances, if it's a binary question or if it's a short form style question, yes, maybe it can just provide you with the exact answer, the correct answer. But for the majority of other bits of tax planning work, there may be intelligent workflows we can build in the future and various other things like that. But I think this is all down to really the second big bet we're making around human AI collaboration. It's building systems which specialist advisors can use to better, either the accountant or the advisor, to better serve their clients directly, or a tax specialist can have in their armory to help advise the accountant and ultimately the client better. Mm-hmm. So yeah, the elephant in the room has always been, is AI going to take our jobs? We don't think it is. We think it's all about empowerment and enablement and just helping you provide a better service, really.
Could it reduce the amount of tax people needed? Because if you can get the answer to these things so much quicker with tech, is there an argument that means you don't need as many tax people?
Essentially, you could. I think with anything that's kind of market-based, efficiencies will come into play. The thing we've always thought about with accountants is that accountants that don't adopt AI, kind of artificially intelligent tools or technologies in their practice, they will be replaced by accountants that do. So that's going to be the shift. I think with specialist tax advisors, yeah, I think there could be an element where it's probably a similar concept that the specialists that adopt artificial intelligence technology will replace those, or just actually there's a finite amount of work available in the market. And I think it's the advisors who adopt AI technology are going to be the ones that start to see a larger share of that work coming their way. And advisors that are not will ultimately end up losing work. But I think that applies to a tax professional. It applies to an accountant. It applies to any other profession. And I think ultimately that's going to apply to the world as a whole, really.
Yeah. On a kind of similar related note, then, because there's one thing like tax advisors working with AI, say, but do we think there's going to be more people like FDs and more generalist accountants that are going to think that they don't need to go get that input now from a specialist tax advisor and try and answer the question themselves, or at least try and answer more questions themselves? Do you see that potentially happening?
I think that's really interesting, potentially. I think what's really interesting is if you don't know the answer on a particular topic, you can do your own research around it. You can try and form your own opinion. I think ultimately humans naturally like to pick the phone up or drop an email or jump on a Teams call and just actually ask a specialist. So, I've done my own research. This is where I think this is the opinion I've arrived at, or this is the answer. This is what I think the answer is to the question. But they still want that kind of confirmation, if you like, or that assurance, that reassurance from a specialist, someone who's been in that area for 5, 10, 15, 20 years. They still want that. They still want that assurance. It's really interesting to see what's going on the kind of the internal finance team side of things. So there's lots of, you've got Mayday, you've got Translucent. There's a couple of other businesses popping up now which are looking at developing applications for internal finance teams. So I think that's fascinating. I think that whole area is going to be really, really interesting to watch over the next few years.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. The reason I asked my question anyway is because I've got like in my mind some of those a handful of clients and people that are pretty well. I think they know the answer to everything already, right? Like some FDs, some accountants think that they can answer every tax question under the sun and do a perfectly good job of implementing tax things. And I always think some you might end up doing it right, but really it's like a 50-50 chance of whether you're going to do it or not. And I think the people that are like that are probably really going to ramp up like their reliance on themselves rather than other people potentially. But you're also right on the flip side. You're going to have people that still like the reassurance, like to check, like to make sure, and those are probably will. So maybe it's not really going to change the world that much because the people who think they can do it themselves now anyway already do it themselves in pretty much all cases.
Yeah, and they always will. I think there's a very small proportion, but yeah, I think it's a mindset thing, right? And I think that's going to be very difficult to change.
Yeah, and it's always frustrating as an advisor because when you know that they're probably going to make a mistake and mess it up, but you just cannot convince them to take the support and advice. It's a real annoying situation.
Yeah. And it comes down to this. The thing with knowledge is it's always evolving, it's always developing, and we talk about the manuals. Case law, for example, is a really good one. So you see something coming through to the first tier tribunal, maybe, and then it's really interesting. A lot of people just stop at that point. This was an FTT case, but it's what happens after that. Where does the appeal go? Ultimately, which cause that ended up in, which has set a precedent for this. And it's following things like the case law. It's following the manual updates. As I said, the legislation is pretty well signposted when that's updated, but there's a huge amount of content for you to digest. And keeping up to date with all of that is tricky. It's hard. It's a lot of information to consume and to understand. And really, I think that's where the technology comes in. Is it can just aid the specialist in that.
Yeah, I think really that's probably where you still need the specialist really to manage the risks of using these type of tools because they're not always right, are they? They might pick up a wrong reference. They might not realize there's alternative interpretations potentially. And so really the only way you're going to manage that risk is to have someone who knows the area well still, I suppose.
Yeah, I mean, when we started the share valuations business a couple of years in, people used to come to us and say, technology is just going to take over. This technology is going to run a share valuation in minutes. So we're not going to need humans to do it. And I think that's a really, really good proxy for what's going on at the moment. And the one thing I was taught very, very early on in my career was, which we kind of pulled through into the share valuation work, was if you end up in front of a judge and the judge says, how did you arrive at this decision? You can't just say, well, I put X, Y, and Z into a computer and this is the answer it gave me. And actually, if you look at some share valuation reports that are computer generated, they're way, way, way wide of the mark in terms of where the valuation of the business is. Because although, yes, the technology can handle some of the stuff. So, inputting the headline financials, maybe running the EBITDA calculations, when it then comes to all the adjustments and the various other bits, what multiple do you arrive at, etc. Really, that's where you need the human touch. You need to understand the business. There's a lot of nuance that goes into a share valuation. You need to understand that. And I think it's exactly the same principle with specialist tax advice, is that the technology can find the case law for you. The technology can probably find the relevant sections of legislation. It can find the relevant guidance in the manuals. It can probably even find it can find the relevant commentary for you. So it can bring everything to the table for you. It can maybe then generate a response, which can guide you in a certain direction. But ultimately, where the specialist comes in is actually understanding the particular client circumstances, the nuance of the situation, and then how you apply everything.
So I think you've answered this already, but just for clarity for some people, how do you think this AI tool and similar ones are different and potentially better than the normal resources that people use nowadays, like the digital online things like Croner and Tolly's? How is it different? Is it because with Croner and Tolly's, for example, you still have to search for the pages to look at, whereas the AI really finds those pages for you and then puts the right one straight in front of you? Is that the big difference, do you think?
Yeah, I think ultimately all roads lead back to workflows, basically, especially where technology is involved. And I think what's really interesting, if you look at the traditional workflow for a reference book, tax research, trying to find the answer, you would lift the book off the shelf. You'd either go contents page or index to try and find the relevant pages. You maybe it's one page, maybe it's 2, 3, or 4 pages to go and look at and some reading around it as well. But ultimately, you would then go to that page, you would read it, you would understand it, you would form an opinion, maybe an answer for yourself. And then maybe that's just for you internally. Maybe that needs to be communicated to the clients. That's how you would do it with a traditional hard copy book. I think with the digital platforms, incredibly similar process, apart from there's obviously a search function now. So instead of going to the contents or the index page, you would effectively search and it would surface some potential pages for you to go and read. Still need to read it, still need to understand it, still need to form an answer, and potentially still need to communicate that to the client. I think what the generative AI technology does is it really just condenses that entire process. You go from having a question to having an answer. You effectively go from A to B. Now the technology does the going to the contents page, the index page, or searching. It does the reading for you. It does the understanding, the knowledge you're trying to generate. It does that for you, and then it also provides you with the pages. So you really just go from A to B. You go from I've got a question, I now have an answer, and actually I can go and see where the answer has been formed. So it speeds up the entire process, makes it more accurate. But I think there's also another subtle point around generative AI, because ultimately it's going out and it's looking at everything. You get a bit of peace of mind, a little bit of security that it has looked at everything. I think if you're doing research yourself, either in a book or in some sort of digital platform, you never know. There's no guarantees that you have looked at everything. What if I'd have just flicked over one more page? Or what if I'd have read that other chapter or the other section that I just didn't think about reading? I think that's where the generative AI technology is really interesting, because it will look at everything, and anything which is potentially relevant, it will surface to your attention. So you do get a bit of certainty around having looked at all the areas.
And that's where most people fall down anyway. I think when doing tax research, is they don't cast their net wide enough, as I like to describe it. They go too narrow too soon, then end up missing relevant pages. So I had an example actually with a trainee in my team probably about 3 years ago now, where I asked them to look into one thing. They found one page in HMRC's manual and they sent it to me and said, I've got the answer. And I looked at it and I thought, I'm pretty sure that answer's wrong, so I need to check this. So I checked it. I could see how they came to that answer based on that one page that they'd sent me. But all they had to do was look at the page before it and they would have come to the conclusion that their current answer was wrong. Do you know what I mean? So that is something that loads of people do, I think. So it's going to be really good to help people with that, I would say.
Yeah, agreed. Absolutely agree with that.
So if people want to learn more about you, Nick, or get in touch, where are the best places for them to go?
Yeah, best thing for practitioners, drop onto tod.tax, so TOD.tax. You can sign up for the review tool there. Just register your interest, fill out the form. That'll sign you up for the review tool. The link for the Copilot tool is also on the website. We've released that in preview phase, so it's freely available at the moment. You can sign up within 30 seconds or so. You're up and running and using the tool, and in time we'll develop that and we'll build that into a commercial model in time. But so yeah, visit the website and all the details are on there.
And LinkedIn, you active on LinkedIn?
Yeah, kind of active on LinkedIn. There's a lot of thought leadership stuff which we've developed, which will be coming out in time. But yeah, I'm on LinkedIn, happy to accept connection requests. Pretty keen to broaden the network in the accountancy space. So yeah, happy for LinkedIn too.
Speaking with Nick certainly helped me to understand AI and tech much better, particularly in the tax space, and I hope it's done the same for you too. We all definitely need to embrace it and move with the times, and as long as we do that, we'll all be fine. The show notes for this episode are at thetaxprofessionalspodcast.com/TTPP90. All the links mentioned throughout this episode are within there, including a link to Nick's website, his LinkedIn profile, a link to sign up for the current free version of Copilot, and also a link to the Tax Research Masterclass. The next Tax Research Masterclass is in February 2024. And if you look into the full details of the Masterclass, you'll also be able to find a one-page summary, which gives you all the key points about the Masterclass, and which you can hand to your employer to help persuade them, I suppose, to cover the cost for you and let you attend during work time. If you enjoyed this episode, make sure you don't miss out on any future episodes of the podcast by signing up for email notifications, which you can do by heading on over to thetaxprofessionalspodcast.com/subscribe. Episodes are bi-weekly and are released on Mondays. But that's it for this episode. I hope you enjoyed the episode and have taken away some useful points to help you to progress, develop, and improve your tax career. Until next time.